Okay, thanks everyone. My name is Flanagan, and I like to run workshops to think about games for social change. I teach at Dartmouth College, and I want to just give you a little bit of an introduction. We start off with a hands-on activity in the day because it's really good to get to meet people and get rolling. But I do want to start off with just thinking about games and what I and my collaborators call games and social values or human values in the game design process. So we're going to be looking at the process of game design really quickly, and also then doing some brainstorming activities. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Have to be caffeinated. Okay. So I am very interested in games and how they communicate things, other than necessarily what we think that they do. A lot of times we'll design a game and we do a lot of playtesting, but sometimes themes emerge from what we're doing that really surprise us sometimes. Games are cultural media. They are ways in which we communicate ideas, beliefs, beyond just something like educating, informing, or raising funds. And they do that whether designers want them to or not. And I have some interesting examples for you just to set the tone of this conversation today. One is this game of Sugoroku. Sugoroku was a Edo period board game style. I'm kind of a history geek, so okay. So let's go back to the Edo period. It's 1700s. It's Japan, and we see a lot of innovations in printing, and there are these really interesting kind of snakes and ladder style board games that were developed that were really heavily image based, really kind of interesting. And you see here that the game actually functions to represent everyday life in the Edo period. Now, what's interesting for me about this is what the game is communicating besides just going around and having something to do with everyday life. You see what's the proper, who actually does the cooking? What's the proper way to greet your elders? How do you assemble for dinner? These kinds of things, games were often used as morality tales or as training for everyday life, and what one should do and not do as far as social mores. So I think that that's a pretty interesting way that games communicate things without necessarily being explicitly about this situation. The game here would also teach a young player how to organize tasks in managing a household, or how to get interested in what it means to, when I grow up, these are the kinds of things I'll do. So it's beyond the life paths and actually teaching some pretty important things. And I have one other social game that actually is a way in which we think about the social reality, and that is the Landlord's game. And the Landlord's game was invented, and I have to go faster because I really want to get to the hands-on stuff, so hopefully you can bear with me. And this game was invented by Lizzie McGee in 1904. She's a daughter of a Quaker minister. She was from Virginia, and she based this game on economic principles of Georgism, which was an advocate for the single tax movement. Does anyone notice anything familiar about this board game?
Monopoly.
Yes. It is. It is, in fact, Monopoly, and a lot of us social activist game designers, cringe at the mention of the word Monopoly, because Monopoly was, in fact, a social impact game. It was initially designed to protest landlords and the land speculation and the way in which there were social inequities in the purchasing and taxation of land. And it eventually, and she patented this, which was the saving grace, and that's the only reason we have a record of this, is because of her patents. And later on, of course, games were kind of self-published, moved around, and eventually someone else took it to Parker Brothers, and it became the best-selling board game of all time. So you see that there's this notion that games have these values embedded in them. This is, of course, from the values of equity and equality onto the value of capitalism and inequality. These are shifts in the game and in the rules, and so how does that happen? How does the game go from one kind of theme to another, one set of values to another set of values? That's the kind of thing that we're going to talk about today. And I do want to just mention a few other things, like values are not new. I mean, many game developers, there are many in the audience I know, also deal with values in games. Here's a little scene from America's Army 2002. Like many of the military academy students are coming in playing America's Army. It is a marketing tool, but it's interesting to look at the values of America's Army as they move through time. In version 1.0 of the game, there's this really interesting kind of declaration of what happens in America's Army about, it emphasizes team play, loyalty, duty, respect. And so this is interesting. So any game developer is bringing to the table their sets of values. But the question then becomes how does that emerge into the gameplay? And I just want to compare this, the early version, to a later version of America's Army and the way that the language changes about values too, because I think this is really interesting. The warrior ethos emerges as something pretty amazing for me. So what are the challenges in making these games? I think everyone's familiar with these challenges. I'm just, you know, we have these technical things, we have business models, we have sustainability, we have affordability, and then this question of design proficiency is what we will be focusing on throughout this day. We can talk to you about business models and possible ways of funding, but the tricky things about getting your social impact message into the game, figuring out what it means in terms of human behavior, these are the core reason to really keep pushing on the design piece of this works, and that's how I think we can help you today, at least open up that door of thinking about game design differently, even if you're an experienced game developer. So we have a project that started in 2006. There are several members of the advisory board in the audience as well, and the project was to look at how human values play out in technological systems, including game design, but rather look at an already finished game. We thought, well, how do we figure out how to ask these humanistic questions in the game design process? And so we've developed tools for doing that, and everything that you see today is available at valuesatplay.org. It's a research project, values at AT, you know, all one word. It's a research project that's funded by the National Science Foundation, and I think what's important about it is that we have a curriculum that you can use. It's all downloadable and free. We actually, I'm going to be using these cards today. We have cards, like finished cards for sale, but we also have the rough versions that you can download and use for free in PDF form, so that if you want to take any of these. And there's also a digital version of this tool set, so there's a little flash app that you can do grow game exercises right online. So just keep that in mind as a resource for you to use whenever you want. And we've also done research on this work as far as using it in game design classrooms, studying across 5 different universities using this material, and it's pretty interesting stuff.